September 19th, 1944. Dawn broke as a pale grey smear over the rolling farmland of Lorraine. Heavy mist clung to the ground, reducing visibility to barely 30 yards. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper stood half-exposed in the turret of his M4A3 Sherman, the smell of wet earth and exhaust heavy in the air. Around him, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion lay in ambush near Arracourt, a name few Americans could yet pronounce, and none would forget. Leiper's breath condensed against the inside of his goggles. Somewhere beyond the haze, the sound of heavy diesel engines throbbed, dozens of them. German armour was advancing. The 113th Panzer Brigade had slipped through the fog overnight, expecting to strike American supply columns. What they found instead were Leiper's men, dug in and waiting. The Shermans had arrived here days earlier with the 4th Armoured Division, low on fuel but high on confidence after racing east from Normandy. They were veterans of the breakout crews who had learned to fight not like textbook tankers, but like hunters. Leiper's gunner, Corporal Ray Adams, whispered through the intercom, "Sir, can't see a damn thing. Rangefinder's useless." Leiper nodded. "We'll move before we shoot. Keep her rolling half-throttle." That single command, "keep her rolling," violated every principle of pre-war armoured doctrine. Until that morning, American tank manuals demanded that Shermans stop before firing to ensure accuracy. Moving shots were considered wasteful, reckless, but the crew had learned differently from bitter experience. When facing Panthers and Tigers, stopping meant dying. The first German tank broke through the fog, barely 40 meters ahead a Panther, its gun pivoting like a hunting cat's head. The Sherman's 75mm roared before it could settle. The shell struck low, detonating against the Panther's side skirt. Adams shouted over the radio, "Hit! Moving left!" Leiper's driver swung the tank hard across the field. A second shot, fired on the move, slammed into the Panther's rear deck. The German tank burst into flame. Within 2 minutes, 3 Panthers lay burning, their crews scrambling into the fog. The Shermans had fired a dozen rounds, all while moving. None had stopped long enough to become an easy target. What German commanders had expected to be a rout became a massacre. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That morning, the battlefield at Arracourt became the proving ground for a new kind of tank warfare. It wasn't about armour, thickness, or gun caliber anymore. It was about movement, the weapon that turned a supposed weakness into a deadly advantage. In the hours that followed, reports from other platoons echoed the same story. German tanks firing blind into the mist, their rounds missing by yards. American Shermans darting between hedgerows, firing on the run, vanishing before the panzers could traverse. By noon, Leiper's battalion claimed 17 enemy tanks destroyed for 3 losses. The ratio stunned observers. Major General John S. Wood, commanding the 4th Armoured Division, would later remark, "They fought like cavalry with cannon." What few realized that morning was that these results were no accident. They were the product of 2 years of painful evolution from North Africa's deadly lessons to Normandy's hedgerows. The US Army had finally abandoned the static, deliberate gunnery of the interwar years. In its place arose a new doctrine: fire on the move, survive by momentum. As night fell, Leiper scribbled in his logbook by flashlight, "Visibility 50 yards, Panthers everywhere. We stayed mobile, they stood still. That's the difference." He closed the notebook and looked across the darkened field where the silhouettes of burning Panthers glowed faintly through the fog. The smell of cordite and hot oil filled the air. In the silence that followed, one truth became clear. The side that mastered motion would master survival. The myth of American armor in 1944 begins years earlier, under the desert sun of North Africa. When US forces first faced the Afrika Korps in 1942, they fought by the book, a book written for another war. Every manual declared that tanks must halt before firing. Movement was for positioning, not engagement. Accuracy, they believed, belonged to those who stood still. But reality had other plans. In Tunisia, American tankers discovered that stillness was suicide. German gunners in Panzer III's and IVs could traverse and fire faster than any stationary Sherman. When the 1st Armoured Division tried to fight properly, they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. The crews learned hard truths written in fire and blood that a Sherman's thin armour was no match for an 88 and that the only defence was motion. One after-action report from Kasserine Pass said it plainly: "When we stopped to fire, we died. When we moved, we lived." By late 1943, those field lessons began filtering through the ranks. Training manuals still preached stability and precision, but platoon leaders in Sicily and Italy started improvising. They discovered that the Sherman's vertical stabilizer, an overlooked device built into the gun mount, could keep the barrel roughly on target while the tank was in motion. British crews had ignored it. American crews began to rely on it. It wasn't perfect. The stabilizer couldn't compensate for terrain bumps or sudden turns, but it kept the gun close enough to line of sight that a quick, instinctive shot could land close, and sometimes close was enough. "You don't need a sniper rifle in a knife fight," one tanker said. "You need to be faster than the other guy." By the time Leiper's platoon landed in Normandy, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had turned those field tricks into instinct. Their drills no longer emphasized firing range precision, but synchronization. The driver, gunner, and commander acting as one organism. They practiced firing bursts on the move, adjusting by feel, not sight. Gunner Ray Adams could track a target through his scope while the driver throttled forward, the stabilizer humming like a gyroscope under his boots. The result wasn't textbook gunnery, it was choreography. The Sherman, often mocked as mechanically inferior, became a dancer of steel, moving in ways the heavier, more rigid German tanks could not. Where Panthers and Tigers dominated open fields, Shermans thrived in chaos: rolling hills, broken villages, misty valleys. They fought like cavalry, closing fast, striking first, vanishing before a reply. When U.S. Army Ordnance analysts later examined combat data, they noticed something remarkable. Engagements in which American tanks fired while moving had a 27% higher first-round hit probability than those where they stopped first. The reason wasn't mechanical, it was psychological. Momentum preserved focus. Standing still invited fear. That's what Arracourt proved beyond doubt. The German counterattack there wasn't meant to fail. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades were equipped with brand new Panthers, the finest tanks Germany had left. Their crews were trained to aim with Teutonic precision, to hold fire until certain. But Arracourt's fog made certain impossible. American crews, used to chaos, treated the mist as a weapon. They fired instinctively, trusting movement more than visibility. Leiper's platoon exemplified that change. As the battle intensified on September 20th, his Shermans executed what one observer called rolling duels. They'd drive through the haze, spot the glint of an enemy gun barrel, and fire before stopping. Panthers fired back, but their slower turret drives and heavier armour made quick reactions difficult. The Germans fired second, and in tank warfare, second was usually last. At headquarters, Colonel Bruce Clark watched the reports roll in platoons of Shermans, claiming kill ratios unheard of. Since Normandy, he radioed division command, "They're fighting like hunters now, not gunners." Doctrine had shifted not by order, but by necessity. By nightfall, the U.S. Army's armour philosophy had transformed. What began as a desperate improvisation in the African desert had matured into a doctrine of fluid motion, one that would define American armoured warfare for decades to come. By 1944, the M4 Sherman was a paradox on tracks underestimated by its enemies, misunderstood by its allies. On paper, it was inferior to nearly every German tank it faced. Its armour was thinner, its 75mm gun weaker, its silhouette taller. But buried inside that rounded turret was a device so subtle that most crews didn't realize how revolutionary it was: the vertical stabilizer. The stabilizer wasn't glamorous. It didn't make the gun fully stable like modern gyroscopes would. Instead, it used a small hydraulic servo to keep the barrel roughly level as the tank moved. To untrained crews, it seemed like a nuisance. It hummed, it drifted, it needed constant recalibration. Many early crews turned it off. But those who mastered it found it changed everything about how they fought. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper had first encountered the stabilizer during stateside training in 1943. The instructor told him, "It's not for accuracy, it's for opportunity." He didn't understand then. By the time he reached France, he did. When your gun was already half aligned as you came out of a turn, a half second meant survival. The stabilizer didn't make a perfect shot. It made a possible shot, and sometimes that was the only kind that mattered. In the calm before Arracourt, Leiper's crew had spent evenings on the Lorraine hills, practicing rolling shots. Ray Adams, the gunner, would aim as the driver. Private Smitty prepped the Sherman forward at 5 miles per hour. Leiper would call out imagined targets. Panther, 11 o'clock, 300 yards. The stabilizer would whine as the barrel tilted, compensating for dips and jolts. Adams would fire. The first shot might miss by a few feet, but the second, adjusted by instinct, often hit home. The crew learned to feel the rhythm of their machine, the recoil, the bounce, the return to center. Meanwhile, the Germans were perfecting something entirely different: mechanical precision. The Panther's long 75mm KUK-42 gun could pierce a Sherman at over 1,000 meters. Its optics were crystal clear, its armor nearly impenetrable from the front. But every shot required the tank to stop, align, and steady. Its suspension was rigid, its traverse slow. Against stationary targets, it was death incarnate. Against moving ones, it was clumsy, like a heavyweight boxer swinging at shadows. That difference was the thin technological line on which Arracourt was fought. The Panther's advantage was in distance, the Sherman's was in time. During the battle's second day, Leiper's platoon intercepted a column of Panthers attempting to flank east of Lizay. The fog was so thick they could barely see 50 yards. The Shermans advanced, firing while creeping forward, shells slamming through the mist. German gunners fired blindly toward muzzle flashes. One Panther's shell screamed over Leiper's turret, missing by inches. Adams fired back without pausing. His shell struck low on the German's hull. Sparks, smoke, then silence. "Keep moving," Leiper shouted. "Never give them your range." That line, "never give them your range," had become the unwritten creed of Sherman crews. The stabilizer allowed them to fire first, correct second, and vanish third. Every second they stayed still invited counterfire. Every motion blurred their silhouette, disrupted the enemy's aim, and made survival statistical rather than suicidal. By the third day of battle, this edge was unmistakable. American after-action reports began to note a curious pattern. The tanks that kept their stabilizers on had far higher survivability rates. The data was small but telling. At Arracourt, Leiper's battalion destroyed over 60 German tanks in less than a week. Many of those kills were made on the move, through fog and rain, often at ranges under 800 yards. After the battle, engineers and officers debated the cause of such success. Some credited the weather, others the pilots spotting from above. But Leiper's men knew better. It wasn't luck. It was a partnership between man, machine, and motion. The stabilizer had turned a mass-produced medium tank into a weapon of agility and instinct. That edge would not fade with the fog of Lorraine. It would become a cornerstone of modern tank doctrine that mobility was not merely movement, but a shield, and that accuracy meant nothing if you didn't live long enough to aim again. That day, as the smoke cleared and the crew climbed from their Sherman, Adams turned to Leiper with a grin. "Guess that noisy contraption finally earned its keep," he said. Leiper just nodded, watching a Panther burn on the horizon. "It's not the gun that wins," he muttered. "It's how fast you make it count." The German crews called it Der Nebelkrieg, the fog war. For the men of the 113th Panzer Brigade, Arracourt was supposed to be a swift counterstroke, a chance to reclaim initiative after months of retreat. They had brand new Panthers, fresh from the factories of Cassel and Nuremberg. Their guns were flawless, their optics pristine, and their confidence restored. But as they rolled into Lorraine's grey morning on September 19th, 1944, none of that mattered. The fog was alive, a shifting, white wall that swallowed sound and light alike. Panthers crept forward at 10 kilometers per hour, their commanders standing half out of their hatches, straining to see beyond 30 meters. Every now and then, a shadow flickered through the mist, friend or foe. No one knew until the gunfire came. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Freiherr, commanding a company of 15 Panthers, had been told the Americans were in full retreat. His orders were simple: advance through the village of Lezay and seize the crossroads. He expected scattered resistance, perhaps a few Shermans. But when the first muzzle flashes erupted from his flank, he realized he'd driven straight into a trap. The first shell struck his lead Panther's track, shearing it clean off. A second hit followed almost instantly, bursting through the rear hull. The tank erupted into flame, its ammunition cooking off in violent pops. Freiherr's radio filled with overlapping voices, panic, confusion, static. "Enemy unseen! We are taking fire from the left!" shouted one commander. Another voice, frantic. "They're moving, I can't hold aim!" Through the mist, Freiherr glimpsed movement, vague silhouettes darting between hedgerows, muzzle flashes blinking like fireflies. The enemy wasn't standing still. They were firing on the move, something his training had never prepared him for. His gunners were trying to track them, but every time the turret locked on, the target had already vanished. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Steady," Freiherr ordered. "Wait for a clear shot." But clear never came. A 75mm round slammed into the side of his wingman's turret. The gun went silent. The fog turned orange with reflected flame. Freiherr realized with horror that the Americans were using the mist the way the Afrika Korps had once used the desert as cover for motion, only this time he was the one blinded by it. For years, German tank doctrine had revolved around the idea of control, perfect coordination, precise firing, tactical dominance through sight and discipline. The Panther embodied that philosophy, a sniper's weapon built for open fields and long lines of fire. But Lorraine offered neither. It was a knife fight in a smoke-filled room, and in that chaos, the Panther's precision became a liability. By mid-morning, radio nets were breaking down. Crews couldn't find their platoon leaders. Panthers collided in the haze. Those that stopped to aim became easy targets. Leiper's Shermans, by contrast, darted in and out of the fog like ghosts. They fired, shifted position, and fired again before the Panthers could respond. To the Germans, it felt like being hunted by phantoms. Freiherr's own tank barely escaped when a shell grazed the commander's cupola, shattering his periscope. His gunner, sweating and shaking, fired back wildly into the mist. No hit confirmed. The tank lurched backward into a ditch. Over the intercom, Freiherr muttered, "They fight like cavalrymen, not soldiers." Hours later, as the fog lifted slightly, he could finally see the battlefield, dozens of burning hulks scattered across the valley, many of them German. Smoke curled upward, merging with the mist. Only then did he realize how completely his force had been outmaneuvered. At Arracourt, the Germans lost nearly 85 tanks in 9 days. Many had never seen the enemy that destroyed them. Reports to higher command blamed the weather, the terrain, even Allied air reconnaissance. Few admitted the deeper truth. The Americans had changed the rules. They had taken what the Germans prized most: accuracy, composure, and control, and replaced it with speed, intuition, and chaos. And chaos, that week, proved deadlier than precision. As dusk fell, Freiherr wrote in his field diary, "They fired while moving reckless, impossible, yet it worked. We stood still, and they danced around us." For the first time since 1940, German tankers were the ones afraid to move forward. The fog had concealed more than enemy armor. It had hidden the birth of a new kind of warfare. By the 5th day of fighting, the men of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had stopped thinking of themselves as tankers. They were hunters, and their prey, the vaunted German Panther, was learning to fear movement. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper's platoon sat hidden behind a low ridge southeast of Lezay. The fields beyond were silent except for the idle rumble of engines cooling in the dawn air. Fog still drifted through the low ground, but the smell of burning oil hung heavier now. The countryside looked like it had been raked by fire. "Sir," Ray Adams murmured through the intercom, "that's 31 confirmed since Monday." Leiper didn't answer. He was studying the map on his knee, tracing a finger toward Arracourt. The enemy would attack again. He knew it. The Germans always came back, but slower, more hesitant each time. The difference wasn't in armor or firepower, it was in rhythm. The Sherman was never meant to win by brute strength. It was built around a principle that most armies still misunderstood. Speed was protection. The M4's gasoline engine, lighter armor, and wide tracks weren't compromises. They were design choices for maneuver. American engineers at Detroit Arsenal had known they could never match German metallurgy, so they chose something else: versatility. The Sherman could climb, pivot, and redeploy faster than any German tank on the Western Front. It was a boxer, not a brawler. At Arracourt, that design philosophy finally met the perfect environment: fog, fields, and broken terrain that punished heavy machines. Panthers bogged down in soft soil where Shermans glided through. When a Panther threw a track, its crew had to abandon it. A Sherman could throw one, repair it, and be back in the fight within hours. "Speed," Leiper told his men before each engagement, "is the only armor we can count on." That wasn't just metaphorical. The psychological speed, the ability to decide faster, became its own weapon. German commanders hesitated, bound by radio discipline and formation tactics. Leiper's men operated by instinct. They used short, sharp commands, not elaborate coordination. 2 left, 1 flank, meant move, fire, relocate. Every man in the platoon knew the pattern. On September 23rd, they proved how deadly that could be. A column of Panthers emerged from the village of Uvalise, unaware that Leiper's platoon waited on the far ridge. Instead of holding their ground, the Shermans charged downhill, an act that would have seemed suicidal weeks earlier. They fired while advancing, shells screaming through the fog. The first Panther halted to return fire, and that pause sealed its fate. Adams' round hit the German just below the turret ring. Flames erupted through the hatches. Leiper's driver swung left, repositioning behind a hedgerow before the next Panther could traverse. The American tanks never stopped moving. Within minutes, 4 Panthers lay crippled, their precision wasted against opponents who refused to play by the old rules. When the firing stopped, the ridge was quiet, except for the crackle of burning fuel. Sergeant Myron Smitty Smith, the driver, exhaled. "Sir," he said, "we just outdanced 'em." Leiper grinned. "That's the point. They can't kill what they can't pin down." Unfolded. Tank Destroyer units, once trained to ambush from fixed positions, began maneuvering offensively. Their commanders realized that hitting first and fading away cost fewer lives than waiting to be spotted. The Germans still had the better guns, that was undeniable. A Panther's 75mm could punch through a Sherman frontally at 1,200 yards. But at Arracourt, engagements happened at less than half that range. Visibility and terrain stripped the Panther of its edge. What mattered was who saw first, who fired first, and who kept moving after firing. The Americans won because they made the battlefield fluid, something the Germans' engineering brilliance couldn't stabilize. By September 25th, the fog was beginning to lift for good. Burned-out Panthers littered the fields, their engines melted into the earth. U.S. Scouts counted more than 80 destroyed or abandoned German tanks. The 4th Armored Division had lost barely a dozen in return. Reporters later called it a miracle of maneuver, but Leiper knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was method born from trial, terror, and the acceptance that motion itself was survival. That night, as his men rested beside their tanks, Leiper wrote in his notebook again, "We're not armored enough to stand still, but if we keep moving, no one can catch us." The Hellcat boys figured it first. Now the Shermans know it too. The next morning, they'd push toward Arracourt, where the fog would thin and the Luftwaffe would finally reappear. But by then, The German tank brigades were already broken. The war in Lorraine had been decided not by who fired the bigger gun, but by who refused to stop firing while moving. September 25th, 1944. The fog had thinned, but the smoke had not. The valley west of Arracourt was a churned-up graveyard of armour German Panthers smouldering in black clusters, Shermans scattered like hunters at rest. For the first time in a week, the sun reached the fields. Its light glinted off twisted steel and glassed mud, a cruel reminder that even victory here had been bought by risk measured in inches and seconds. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper's platoon was running on fumes physically and literally. They had been fighting for 6 straight days, sleeping in shifts, eating cold rations off tank decks. Their radios crackled with exhaustion as much as static. Yet every man knew the Germans weren't finished. The 11th Panzer Division had arrived from the Saar veterans, disciplined and determined to reclaim the initiative that the 113th and 111th Brigades had squandered. "Sir, they're regrouping south of Les," Adams reported, leaning over the periscope. "How many?" Leiper asked. "Enough to make us wish for air cover." The Luftwaffe had briefly reappeared that morning, 190 seconds swooping low to strafe the American columns. One strafing run tore through a nearby M10 tank destroyer, killing its crew. The men ducked inside their tanks until the sky quieted. The battle for Arracourt was entering its final, furious phase. By noon, German armour surged again, this time with discipline. Panthers advanced in pairs, covering each other's movement, firing short bursts to mask their approach. They were learning. Leiper saw the change instantly. "They're adapting," he warned over the platoon net. "No blind charges this time. We're in for a real fight." The Shermans repositioned behind a slight rise near Les, hulls down, guns scanning the misty horizon. The smell of wet fuel and cordite filled the air. Then, through the haze, came the low, steady thump of treads. Panthers, maybe 20 of them. Leiper's heart hammered. "All right, boys," he said quietly. "We do this fast. Stay mobile. Fire and fade." The first muzzle flash from the German line came at 1,000 yards, a bright orange spark in the grey. The shell howled overhead and struck the ridge behind them. Dirt rained down across the Shermans. "Move! Move!" Leiper shouted. The tanks lurched forward, throttling hard. Adams tracked the first Panther through the gun sight as the stabilizer whined beneath him. "On target! Firing!" The Sherman 75mm roared. The shell struck the Panther's glacis and ricocheted, a flash of sparks. "Hit but no penetration," Adams yelled. "Keep firing," Leiper ordered. The second shot, fired while the Sherman rolled downhill at an angle, smashed into the Panther's side armour. It burned within seconds, a column of flame tearing through the mist. To their left, another Sherman was hit a clean shot through the turret. The crew scrambled out, smoke trailing from their uniforms. Leiper's driver, Smitty, swore. "Jesus, that was Donnelly's tank, he's down." The battle dissolved into chaos. The Germans were firing accurately now, each Panther shifting as soon as it discharged. The air stank of burning oil and high explosives. Yet, amid the thunder, the American doctrine, the very thing forged from desperation, began to assert itself again. Leiper's Shermans didn't hold ground. They created it. They moved in erratic, overlapping patterns, never pausing long enough for a Panther to zero in. Adams fired on instinct, using the stabilizer's hum as a rhythm. Each round was a heartbeat. Aim, fire, move. Aim, fire, move. One shell found a Panther hiding behind a haystack, the explosion lifting the tank's turret clear from the hull. Another Sherman, firing while reversing, scored a hit through a gap in the fog, pure reflex, guided by years of practice. By late afternoon, the German advance had collapsed. Panthers burned in the fields, their crews fleeing on foot. The 11th Panzer Division had lost 15 tanks in a single push. U.S. losses, 3 Shermans, 2 damaged beyond repair. At dusk, Leiper's tank rolled to a halt beside a wrecked Panther. Its armour was blackened, its engine still ticking from heat. Leiper climbed out, boots sinking, into the churned mud. He placed a hand on the German tank's steel, still warm. "They're learning too slow," he murmured. Behind him, Adams leaned out of the turret. "Think they'll try again tomorrow?" Leiper stared across the valley where the smoke hung like twilight fog. "They can't afford to. They've lost the field and the tempo." He was right. The next day, German commanders called off the attack. Arracourt was finished. The US had destroyed nearly 5 times as many tanks as it had lost. Analysts would later call it the finest example of mobile defensive warfare in the European campaign. But for Leiper's men, the meaning was simpler. Motion had saved them. That night, as the fires burned and rain began to fall, Leiper wrote his final note of the battle. "We never stopped moving. They stopped to aim and died standing still." September 26th, 1944. The battlefield around Arracourt no longer sounded like war, only like what came after. The rain had turned the earth into paste, swallowing tank tracks, cooling metal that had burned for days. The fields, once echoing with the roar of engines, now whispered with wind and the quiet murmur of men counting the dead. Lieutenant Leiper sat on his Sherman's glacis, a cigarette trembling in his fingers. Around him, crews moved slowly between the carcasses of Panthers and Shermans, checking for survivors, collecting shell casings, retrieving notebooks. The valley was littered with wreckage, some tanks upright, others flipped into ditches, their tracks twisted like ribbon. For the first time in 8 days, no one was firing. When the engineers arrived, they couldn't believe the ratio. In barely 10 days of combat, U.S. tankers of the 4th Armored Division and 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed over 250 German tanks and assault guns, while losing fewer than 50 of their own. The Germans had attacked with superior armour and longer guns, yet they were outmaneuvered, outscouted, and outthought. Colonel Bruce Clark called it a lesson in movement. He told his officers, "A tank isn't a bunker, it's a hammer, and hammers don't sit still." The analysts who arrived after the battle wanted numbers. They wanted to understand how a supposedly inferior machine, a Sherman, with its 75mm gun and paper-thin sides, had turned back an entire panzer corps. Leiper's men didn't have theories. They had instinct. "We stopped fighting their kind of war," Adams said to a war correspondent that day. "They were hunting for stationary targets. We became moving ones." It was more than just mobility. It was the psychological inversion of what the Germans had taught the world to fear. For years, Allied doctrine had been reactive, defend, then reinforce, then retreat if needed. But at Arracourt, the Shermans rewrote that rhythm. They took initiative, not by standing their ground, but by stealing it from the enemy, yard by yard, shot by shot. Historians would later note that the 11th Panzer Division's commanders were trapped in a tactical delusion. They still believed in the power of static precision, of long-range gunnery duels fought from perfect hull-down positions. But in Lorraine's shifting fog, precision meant nothing if the target never stopped moving. Every Sherman that kept rolling disrupted the German gunners' range-finding. Every tank that fired on the move forced a Panther to second-guess its lead. By the time the Germans tried to correct their aim, the Shermans were already behind them, firing again. One after-action report summed it up bluntly. "Our tanks fought like cavalry, not fortresses." It wasn't just tactics, it was evolution under fire. The Americans had built a doctrine on experience rather than theory. They'd learned that the stabilizer wasn't a luxury, it was survival. That initiative wasn't measured by armor thickness, but by tempo. Leiper's crew didn't talk much that night. They sat in the drizzle beside their tank, eating rations in silence, listening to the artillery thud miles away. The valley smelled of diesel and wet earth. The adrenaline was gone now, replaced by a numb exhaustion that didn't feel like triumph. Adams finally broke the silence. 5-1, he said quietly. "That's what they're saying. 5 of them for every one of us." Leiper exhaled smoke. "Numbers don't mean much to the ones who didn't make it back." He looked across the field, where medics were lifting the bodies of 2 friends, Donnelly and Rourke, into stretchers. Both had died in the first week, before anyone realized they were winning. Still, the The sense of change hung in the air, something shifting in the psychology of the men. For the first time, they didn't just survive against the Panzers, they dominated them. The myth of German invincibility had cracked open, right there in the muddy hills of Lorraine. Far away, in the War Department's analysis rooms, the lessons of Arracourt began to ripple outward. Training manuals were revised. Tank platoon exercises now emphasized constant motion, overlapping arcs of fire, and coordinated radio calls. The phrase "fire on the move" was no longer a footnote, it became doctrine. By October, the German armoured thrusts in Lorraine were broken. The panzer divisions pulled back toward the Saar, abandoning their wrecks. For the first time since Normandy, American tankers advanced without hesitation. As the division rolled eastward, Leiper's Sherman led the column. The stabilizer hummed beneath them like a heartbeat, a sound they once distrusted, now a promise they wouldn't fight without. He keyed the radio, his voice steady despite the fatigue. "Keep it rolling, boys. We don't stop till the river." And somewhere behind them, the burned-out hulks of Arracourt's Panthers hissed in the rain-silent monuments to a lesson the Americans had learned faster than the Germans could unlearn their pride. October 1944. Lorraine was grey again. The fog had returned gentler now, rolling over the same hills where, weeks earlier, men had fought to the edge of sanity. The fires were out, the guns silent, but the ground still bore their story. Shell holes filled with water, fragments of armour half buried like fossils of a war that hadn't yet ended. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper sat inside his Sherman, engine idling low, the vibration steady beneath him. He looked out across the valley where so many had fallen. It was peaceful now, almost insultingly so. Crows perched on the carcass of a panther, the same one that had nearly killed them. Its black cross was half obscured by soot, its barrel drooping like a broken arm. Adams was perched in the commander's hatch, helmet off, staring east. "Feels wrong being this quiet," he muttered. Leiper nodded. "Yeah. You get used to the noise, not the silence after." For the men of the 4th Armoured Division, Arracourt had become something legendary, but not in the way outsiders imagined. The newspapers called it a triumph of American armour, a victory of superior tactics over superior machines. But the men who'd been there didn't see a clean victory. They saw wreckage, luck, and exhaustion masquerading as brilliance. Still, even in the mud and grief, something extraordinary had happened, something that changed the way an army thought. For 3 years, the Germans had defined armoured warfare. From Poland to France to the steppes of Russia, their doctrine of blitzkrieg had seemed untouchable, fast, coordinated, devastating. The Allies had spent half the war reacting, building thicker armour, bigger guns, always chasing the ghost of German precision. But Arracourt reversed the current. The Americans hadn't just matched German aggression, they'd outmaneuvered it by doing something deceptively simple. They never stopped moving. In that fog, the myth of the perfect shot, the duelists' war died. The battlefield had become fluid, unpredictable, and deeply human. The stabilizer, once mocked as an American gimmick, had become a symbol of adaptability. It allowed an imperfect tank to act faster than perfect machines constrained by old habits. As one analyst wrote afterward, "The Sherman did not win because it was stronger. It won because it was alive." That phrase echoed in Leiper's mind when, weeks later, he was called to brief a group of newly arrived officers. Young, clean, unscarred, they asked questions in neat voices about tactics, about range-finding and visibility. One asked, "Lieutenant, how did you know when to stop and aim?" Leiper smiled faintly. "We didn't," he said. "Stopping was what killed you." There was laughter, but not from him. The irony was too sharp. They had turned fear into doctrine, necessity into advantage. And though Arracourt would be remembered as a battle of tanks, it had been, at its core, a battle of ideas. When the reports reached Berlin, the German High Command dismissed them as isolated setbacks. They refused to believe that Shermans could defeat Panthers without air support or numerical superiority. Their pride had become their doctrine, and their doctrine their weakness. By contrast, the US Army took Arracourt as gospel. Every armoured manual written afterward emphasized motion, initiative, and the psychological edge of aggression. Tankers were taught to fight like hunters, not defenders. And in that transformation lay the war's quiet irony. The very tactic born from desperation, firing on the move to survive, became the signature of an advancing force that would soon cross into Germany itself. That winter, as the front shifted east, Leiper's platoon pushed on through Saarbrücken and toward the Rhine. They carried with them the ghosts of Arracourt, the smell of diesel and smoke, the rhythm of the stabilizer beneath their boots, the memory of how fragile victory had felt. Sometimes, at night, when the engines cooled and the valley was still, Leiper would remember the sound of their first moving shot, that wild, improbable hit in the fog. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it was the sound of a crew refusing to die, standing still. He realized that was the truth of Arracourt, not the numbers, not the kill ratios, not even the legend. The real victory was that ordinary men, trapped in impossible machines, had found a way to turn fear into fluid motion. They had made imperfection a weapon. In the end, the lesson wasn't about armor or guns. It was about adaptation, the kind that only comes when survival demands invention. As Leiper's Sherman rolled east under the grey October sky, he glanced back one last time at the fields of Lorraine. Smoke still curled from the wrecks, thin and blue, drifting like memory itself. He keyed the radio and said quietly, "Keep moving," because in that single phrase, born of chaos, refined in fog, and proven by fire, lay the irony of Arracourt. They learned to move, not to win faster, but to die slower, and in doing so, they won.